Is the West defined by Christian or pagan values? This is a debate which has been explicit in the intellectual tradition since Nietzsche, and implicit in the history of the West ever since the Christianization of Rome. Today, those on the side of pagan values argue that it is the Greeks, the inventors of heroism, who stand at the genesis of Western civilization. They argue that all of our values have pagan origins, that the West was born with the great feats of Hercules and Achilles, but Christians argue that it was during the Middle Ages that the first self-conscious, pan-European culture came about under Christianity. And they have a point. Though a lot of classical culture and pagan heritage was lost or destroyed during the Dark Ages, they also produced a colorful, heroic culture, in many ways equal in its splendor to classical culture. When one thinks of the Western heroic tradition, does one not at once conjure the image of a knight astride a massive steed with polished armor gleaming in the sun? The culture of medieval European chivalry, as preserved for us in Arthurian literature, is as distinctly heroic and European as the culture of the Greeks and the Vikings, and I believe that the corpus of Arthurian literature is as much an essential part of the Western heroic canon as Homer and the Norse Sagas. This is because the chivalric worldview of Arthurian literature is an extension of the same heroic worldview found in the writings of the Hellenes and the Norse. And the Christianity of these texts is, in a certain sense, a pagan Christianity. And here I use pagan in a general sense, to refer to the worldview and values which were native to Europe since antiquity and before, the heroic worldview. A worldview which in no way resembles the Abrahamic faiths of the East, or early Christian values and sentiments which were anti-Roman and anti-pagan. And I also use pagan here to invoke its original meaning, rustic, rural, natural, pertaining to the practices, gods, and beliefs of the European countryside. The Christianity of Arthurian literature is very much a religion of the land and forests of Europe, of nature, of spirits, apparitions, and mysteries in the Greek sense. Arthurian Christianity is an essentially mystical, pagan worldview, with the mystery of Christ and the Grail at its center. Its Christ is an Eleusinian Christ, who evokes Dionysus, Persephone, and Odin, a god of nature, of miracles, of blood, wine, and the mystery of the immortality of vegetative life achieved through reproduction. The Arthurian Christ is a god of chivalry, a king of heroes, and himself a hero who, like Persephone, Hercules, and many other pagan heroes, made the descent into the underworld and rose again triumphant. The canon of Arthurian literature, which is part of the literary category referred to as the Matter of Britain, is extremely extensive. From these texts we get the tales of Lancelot and Guinevere, King Arthur and his court at Camelot, Merlin and Morgan Le Fay, Percival and the quest for the Grail, Gawain and the Green Knight. But to understand these tales we must understand the historical setting. Somewhere around 600 BC, the Celts began to migrate into the British Isles, influencing them culturally, genetically, and linguistically. In 43 AD, the Romans began their conquest of Britain and settled most of England, then inhabited by the Britons. The Romans established a colony called Britannia, but they were unable to take what is now Scotland, Ireland, or Wales. The Romans brought with them their infrastructure, Latin, and Christianity during the nearly 400 years which they ruled over the Britons. But when the Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome in 410, the Romans withdrew from England. The Roman Britons were left to defend themselves against the rest of the Celts, the Irish, Scottish, and Picts, who had not been conquered by Rome, and this was the beginning of the Dark Ages. The Britons attempted to recruit the Saxons from the mainland to defend them against their northern adversaries. But when the Germanic tribes saw the opportunity for easy settlement, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, coming from Germany and Denmark, invaded Britain. However, we know from the archaeological record that the Roman Britons managed to temporarily halt the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain and even cause them to retreat. And we have several references to a great leader who led this defense. The most concrete comes from the 6th century monk Gildas. On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, he writes, quote, "The poor remnants of our nation, being strengthened by God, took arms under the conduct of Ambrosius Aurelianus, a modest man, who, of all the Roman nation, was then alone in the confusion of this troubled period, by chance left alive. His parents, who for their merit were adorned with the purple, had been slain in these same broils, and now his progeny, in these our days, although shamefully degenerated from the worthiness of their ancestors, provoked to battle their cruel conquerors, and by the goodness of our Lord obtained the victory." End quote. So we have ample evidence for a figure who perhaps had partial Roman ancestry and led the Britons in defense against the Saxon invasion. This figure would later come to be named Arthur by medieval historians, a great king and military leader who was born in Tintagel and was buried nearby at Glastonbury. And it just so happens that at the archaeological site of Tintagel, we have the ruins of a fortified British settlement from around the time when this Arthur would have lived. A settlement with a complex material culture, which appears to show that they were trading with the Mediterranean and even Constantinople by sea, which is extremely impressive given these circumstances, but also makes sense for a once Roman colony. And it was at this site that they found a partial inscription with the name Artogano. The evidence for Arthur's connection with this Roman Briton warlord is much more extensive, but in short, it seems likely that Arthur was a historical figure, and the story of this great leader, who for a time managed to halt the Saxons, would serve as the foundation of the Arthurian tradition, which was shared by the peoples of medieval Europe. The canon of Arthurian literature is vast, and the texts are written in Latin, Welsh, Old French, Middle English, Middle High German, and Old Norman. Arthurian literature is the culmination of all of these peoples and their pagan traditions syncretized with Roman Christianity. In this sense, they are truly medieval texts, as they represent the matrix of Northern European peoples and cultures out of which arose the medieval iteration of the heroic ideal. I would go so far as to say that Arthurian literature was, for medieval Europe, what the Iliad was for the Greeks. The key ideas of Arthurian literature are the knight, romance, and chivalry. Romance was originally a literary term, denoting that a text was written in a dialect, i.e. a Romance language, rather than Latin. It is Chretien de Troyes' 5 chivalric romances, written in Old French, which serve as the foundation of all Arthurian literature which followed. It is through the Arthurian romances that romance came to mean what it does today, a heroic, chivalric view of love and passion, which I would argue was already present in the classical tradition, but which was certainly solidified in Arthurian literature. In Chretien's romances, we also get the notion of chivalry, which comes from the French word chevalier, meaning knight, which in turn comes from the French cheval, meaning horse. Here, all the way in the Middle Ages, and I would argue even as late as the cowboys of the American frontier, we see echoes of the Indo-European horse warriors. The cheval was the medieval iteration of the classical hero, and in the notion of chivalry, we see a romantic vision of heroism, which makes use of what are, at least nominally, Christian values. Yet, as I said earlier, the essence of medieval chivalry is classical and pagan in nature. I will give an example. In Chretien de Troyes' Knight of the Cart, an unknown knight arrives at Arthur's court during the Ascension Day feast, which celebrates Christ's ascension to heaven after he descended into hell and freed the souls imprisoned there. The mysterious knight announces that Guinevere has been taken to the land of Gore and is being held there. He says, quote, "I do not bring you news of them because I intend to return them to you. Rather, I want to inform you that you have neither wealth nor power enough to ensure their release, and you know well that you will die before you are able to come to their aid." End quote. As seen in this passage, the land of Gore is continually referred to using the language of death, and is clearly on one level the Celtic otherworld, with the mysterious knight being the king of the dead. Guinevere thus plays the role of Persephone here, to use the most commonly known version of this pagan motif. Lancelot sets out after Guinevere, thus taking on the role of both the classical hero and Christ in his descent into the other world. He soon encounters a dwarf in a cart, who says that he can bring Lancelot to the land of Gore if he gets into the cart. Here we see the pagan ferryman motif. But out of shame, Lancelot hesitates 2 steps before getting into the dwarf's cart. Chretien writes, quote, "He would regret this moment of hesitation, and be accursed and shamed for it. Reason, who does not follow love's command, told him to beware of getting in, and counseled him not to do anything by which he might incur disgrace or reproach, but love urged and commanded him to climb into the cart at once." End quote. As Lancelot enters into the kingdom of Gore, into the land of the dead, he also enters into a state of sin due to his hesitation. We are told explicitly that Lancelot's sin was showing cowardice by not giving himself fully to love, to passion, to daring, and by hesitating before entering the cart for fear of shame. This notion of sin is very different from the idea of sin in early and later Christianity. Lancelot's sin is cowardice. It is equivalent to if Achilles had hesitated before leaping into battle to avenge Patroclus. And the idea of love here is very different from other Christian notions of love. Love here is heroic passion. I could give countless other examples of how these texts, despite being within a Christian framework, are essentially pagan in their character, setting, and worldview. One example is the use of nature as a creator, synonymous with God. In Eric and Enid, Chretien first describes Enid's beauty as follows, quote, "The maiden was charming, in sooth, for nature had used all her skill in forming her. Nature herself had marveled more than 500 times how, upon this one occasion, she had succeeded in creating such a perfect thing. Never again could she strive so successfully to reproduce her pattern. Nature bears witness, concerning her, that never was so fair a creature seen in all the world. The complexion of her forehead and face was clearer and more delicate than the lily, but with wondrous art her face with all its delicate pallor was suffused with a fresh crimson, which nature had bestowed upon her. Her eyes were so bright that they seemed like 2 stars. God never formed better nose, mouth, and eyes. What shall I say of her beauty?" End quote. Here, nature is repeatedly invoked as a creator and referred to as she, and it is only towards the end of the passage that God appears. I consider Chretien to be the most essential author in the Arthurian tradition, the one who most vividly represents this heroic, Christian yet pagan worldview. But there are many other great works in this tradition. Yet, during the Grail cycle of Arthurian literature, you can notice a distinctive shift in the worldview. The emphasis of the stories shifts from heroic values to Christian ascetic morality, with particular emphasis on chastity. Whereas in the earlier texts, Lancelot was considered to be the best knight because of his beauty and skill in combat, his excellence in love and war. In the Grail cycle, Percival is put forward as the better knight because he, unlike Lancelot, is moral and chaste. He does not pursue glory or the hands of fair maidens. He pursues only Christ and the Grail. Lancelot, in all his classical perfection, is shamed for his affair with Guinevere. Though he is a warrior equal in skill and beauty to Achilles, he is ultimately a failure because he is not chaste, not moral. And it may come as no surprise that many of the tales in this cycle of Arthurian literature were written by monks, not bards and poets like Chretien. And here we get to the heart of the issue and of my argument. It is the heroic ideal, not the priestly ideal, which defines the Western tradition. Whether one is devoted to Odin, Christ, or Jupiter, in the end it is ultimately secondary to something more essential, whether one has a heroic and natural worldview. It is, and always has been, heroic values which define the West, and everything which goes against those values, whether it be the priestly forms of Christianity or American leftist and conservative ideology, is hostile to the West and seeks ultimately to strangle it. But the Christianity of Arthurian romance, on the whole, is distinctly heroic. In the Parzival of Eschenbach, a German author, Parzival is raised in the woods by his mother. After the death of Parzival's father, a knight, she seeks to prevent Parzival from following in his father's footsteps. Parzival's mother conceals his true identity from him and tells him nothing of knighthood. Yet, as a young man, Parzival encounters a knight while hunting in the woods, and when he sees the imposing figure atop his steed, clad in brilliant armor, Parzival thinks that he sees an angel. And learning of knighthood, he departs at once from the woods and the safety of his mother's care to become a knight. Knighthood for Parzival is something internal, something in his blood, not a moral imperative, but an inborn destiny which he cannot escape. As a child, I, like many of you, I'm sure, spent many hours pretending to be a knight, inspired by Disney movies and tales of the Knights of the Round Table, brandishing sticks or dollar store plastic swords, slaying dragons, and saving maidens. What inspires young men is not the morality of the knight, his commitment to virginity or charity. Young men feel in their blood that there is something divine, something superhuman in Lancelot and his deeds. The knight radiates beauty and power, a beauty and power which is expressed in his heroic feats. So I beseech you, my Christian brothers, do not be tricked into thinking that your religion must be an anti-pagan religion which scorns nature. Do not be tricked into thinking that Christ can be only a God of chastity, charity, and all of the other thin and prudish modern moral values. Do not shame your ancestors and their heroes for being immoral. Choose the Christ who loved Lancelot for his beauty and courage. Choose the Christ who animated the forests of medieval Europe and stirred the hearts of knights to bold and courageous action. The Christ who ignited in the hearts of fair ladies burning passion for their chivalrous lovers. Choose the Christ who is present in the springtime lilies, the flushed cheeks of the lover, and the blood of the slain. Choose the Christ of Europe.
You expect of me a speech? I've only one to give. And it is the same one I'd give were we not standing on the brim of a battlefield. It is the same one I'd give were we to meet in the street by chance. I've only ever hoped for one thing. To see this kingdom united under this English crown. All men are born to die, we know it. We carry it with us always. If your day be today, so be it. Mine will be tomorrow. Or mine today and yours tomorrow, it matters not. What matters is that you know in your hearts that today you are that kingdom united. You are England. Each and every one of you. England is you. And it is the space between you. Fight not for yourselves. Fight for that space. Fill that space. Make it tissue. Make it mass. Make it impenetrable. Make it yours. Make it England. Make it England. Great men to it, captains, lords. Great men to it.